My name is Nathan Paulai. I am a sophomore here at UD. I'm an environmental science major and English major here. Today we're going to be welcoming Dr. Curt Meine.
Is it on now or does it have to be green?
He's coming to campus today to discuss the Aldo Leopold Legacy. Curt, I'm going to do a little bio over him before he comes up. Curt received his undergraduate degree at DePaul University in Chicago. He majored in English and history. He then found himself finding an attraction for the environmental studies out in the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he earned his master's and PhD in their Institute of Land Resources. Following his graduate school, Curt is now the director for conservation biology and history at the Center of Humans and Nature. He is also a senior fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation, research associate with the International Crane Foundation, and associate adjunct professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. However, Curt might be best known for his being the author of Aldo Leopold, His Life and Work, which science described as an excellent full-length biography of a figure central to the environmental history of the United States. He is also co-editor of the Essential Aldo Leopold, both published by the University of Wisconsin Press. Curt Mine's visit is being organized by the University of Dubuque's environmental literature students who are members of the university's honors program. It is being supported by the University of Dubuque's Diamond Initiative, which is the philosophy of the university that employs caring intrusiveness to develop holistic learning outcomes focused on academic stewardship, community and character, and vocation. Without further ado, Dr. Curt Meine.
Thanks, buddy. I just had to write that phrase down. Caring intrusiveness. I don't want to forget that. That's a good one. All right. Thank you. Thank you all for making me very busy today, but delightfully so. I've had a really fun time. Met a number of you all in your classes, and I won't say thank you to everybody because I don't remember names very well, and I would miss somebody. So a mass collective thank you from me for letting me come down and spend the day with you and learn a little bit more about this place. I think I may have been here once or twice before long ago, but this was my first chance to really spend time at the University of Dubuque. And I hope it's only like an hour from where I live. I'm practically in your backyard. So thank you. And how do I start this presentation? Well, we'll start with just the image. And I don't know if we want to, that's okay. We can leave it up. You can see that well enough, I trust. And the reason I chose this image, I would usually pick something like the Upper Mississippi River or Dubuque or something. But this is my big picture. The big picture, because that's my theme for the evening. And it is fun to look at, isn't it? It's an amazing photo. There's many others you could choose, but I particularly like this one, partly because I give a lot of talks about water, it seems, and this is a great water image. But it is a big picture, and we can locate ourselves. We are here. There's Chicago, so Dubuque is in there, right? So you can find yourself in it. And I often use this photo, by the way, when I'm giving a talk where a lot of non-Midwesterners come, if they're like an international talk. And I'll often show this because they know the Great Lakes, kind of. They may, go to Chicago, turn right, that's Wisconsin. But otherwise, they're not very well oriented to our Midwestern landscape if they're not from the region. So this is a fun one to use to do that as well. But symbolically, using the big picture is really the key to my topic here of conservation across the landscape. Because the big picture really is all about us working together across that landscape and finding our connections and strengthening them and realizing that we have to do that. We have little time to lose in doing that. But there's a more positive way of thinking about it, that when we do renew our connections, understand our connections, when we strengthen them, we can renew ourselves and our lands and waters and our communities and economies, and we can renew our hope and our vision. That is my hope. And that is, again, what this picture symbolizes. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give a brief, very brief opening orientation, just using a couple quotes to this topic of across the landscape conservation, from wildlands to working lands to urban lands. I'm going to do a little slideshow about the project I worked on with the documentary film Green Fire. Some of you, anyone had a chance to see Green Fire, our film about Aldo Leopold? A few of you. You don't have to have seen the film. You'll get the storyline, and you can watch it some other time. And then going to talk about a framework for understanding what I'm trying to convey with this idea of thinking about conservation across the landscape, and especially how that relates to our concepts of sustainability. And then a few concluding thoughts, and hopefully lots of good questions and answers. So, let us begin. Let me see if, there we go. We'll take the stuff off there. Just pause for a moment. You were asking me, where was my favorite spot? Oh, it's about right here, right here. So we all see this map, and we maybe can locate ourselves within it too, somehow, some way, right? But this is another favorite spot. This is not far from here. This is up the Mississippi River Valley, up in a little town called Coon Valley, Wisconsin, just east of La Crosse. It's a background slide for this. First, I'm just going to use two quick quotes to open this up from Aldo Leopold. Conservation viewed in its entirety is the slow and laborious unfolding of a new relationship between people and land. Slow and laborious unfolding. 1940, he said that. Sometimes you want to say, gee, Aldo, couldn't it be a little less slow and a little less laborious? But we are still continuing on the track of building a new relationship between people and land. Coon Valley, as you'll learn a little bit more about, is one of the places where he was working during those years. And this one, I often use this when I'm giving talks in Iowa or Illinois, you know, right? The landscape of any farm is the owner's portrait of himself or herself. Conservation implies self-expression in that landscape rather than blind compliance with economic dogma. Well, I like both of these quotes a lot. And the second one is not just about farming in a farm landscape. I like this one because then I like to add on, Aldo wasn't just the farm. The whole landscape of America is a collective portrait, right, of ourselves. It reflects and reveals who we are, our values and philosophies, our policies and priorities, our economy, our technologies, our knowledge, our sense of beauty, our sense of justice, our history, our hopes. Every landscape expresses the culture of those who live on it and within it. So the landscape of our nation, of our continent, is our collective portrait of ourselves. So those are the big opening thoughts. And now we'll dive into our little slideshow presentation. Again, this is the film we did, and I originally put this presentation together to go along with that film. So you don't have to have seen it. That's the fun part of this. But what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes or so is introduce you to some of the people and places we encountered along the way of doing this project. Now, let me ask you this. How many of you know who Aldo Leopold is? All right, a few of you, you know, this is a new character for you. That's okay too. Leopold, for many, is regarded as the most influential conservationist of the 20th century. But in our film, we were trying to do what the subtitle implies. We're trying to connect him to what's going on in our own landscape in our own time and make those connections for the next generation. So we visited a lot of people and places. And The short story of this is I ended up being in the film. It wasn't the original intent, and it was certainly not my desire, but I ended up being in the film as the narrator and on-screen guide, which was sometimes fun, but not all the time. It was a lot of work, but the best part of it was being able to hang out with lots of amazing, amazing people. So this, oops, let me go back, if I can. Oh well.
I'm going to arrow back.
Arrow back, arrow back. Previous, there we go. Previous. Oh, he's got to work on your, there we go. Scott Momaday, there he is. Anyone hear of Scott Momaday? All right. There's a few literature folks in the crowd. He's probably the best known Native American writer of his generation. First Native American to win a Pulitzer Prize, actually. He was confined to a wheelchair when we met him. What an amazing guy. When we arranged this interview, my mutual friend said, this man has a large soul. And indeed he does. I really recommend him if you're interested in that. So we began the story of Aldo Leopold, this middle 20th century scientist from Iowa, actually, by talking with one of the great elders in Native American literature. Oops, there we go. And we visited places like this out in the southwest, the Gila Wilderness, one of the most beautiful parts of New Mexico, not far from where Aldo Leopold worked. In fact, he was responsible for the creation of the Gila Wilderness, the first wilderness area in the country in 1924. We visited with Dave Foreman. Some people know his name. If you're of an age, you'll recognize him as the eco-warrior. He was the great defender of wilderness and remains so to this day, one of the founders of Earth First, regarded by many as a radical environmentalist. You wouldn't know it from that picture, would you? He looks like a pussycat, and he really is a gentle spirit. But he is a strong voice for the protection of the wild, and has been for 45 years now. We went off to places like this, a large ranch in central New Mexico, to meet with this fella, Sid Goodloe. He's a rancher, a very good friend of mine. He's now in his 80s, well known in his community out there for being a renegade rancher, because he was one of the first to use fire to do restoration of his grasslands and his watershed. This was not what was normal back in the 1960s and 70s. And he told us the story of that. So all those big wide open places out west, but we came back to the Midwest here. Whoops, where's Nina? There's Nina. Aldo Leopold's daughter, Nina Leopold. She was 90 years old, I think, when this picture was taken. So here we are in the Midwest, a very different landscape. Now we're dealing with family members. We're dealing with landscapes more familiar to people in this audience, you know, this kind of mixed Midwestern landscape of farms and wetlands and riverways, woodlots and crop fields and pastures. It's not the wilderness. It's not the big wide open West, right? This is the important bird area along the Wisconsin River, where the Leopold Shack is, for those of you who are familiar with Sand County Almanac. The Leopold property is right in the middle of this study area for conservation of birds. There's the Wisconsin River right near Leopold's Shack. We brought in a good friend of mine, this fellow, George Archibald. George, MacArthur award-winning ornithologist and bird conservationist, who since 1973 has traveled all over the world to conserve the 15 species of cranes wherever they occur, and the human communities where they exist. George is a well-known fella in conservation circles, but his passion is being out there in wetlands with birds. He is pure joy when he's out, and bring him down here sometime. We visited Coon Valley. Again, this would look familiar to you because you're in the driftless area of Wisconsin now. And this little village became the site of a revolution in the 1930s in watershed restoration, restoring Coon Creek from its degraded state to a top now level trout stream. Rich area for farmers, dairy farming. Amish farmers are common in that region. So it's again a very different landscape now out in the rugged driftless area. We had an interview there with this fellow, almost a neighbor of yours, Paul Johnson. Paul's a farmer up in Decorah. Well known in Iowa. He served in the Iowa State Legislature for 8 years. Helped create the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture at Iowa State University. Leading conservation voice, another great asset to our country. He served for 4 years as head of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, federal agency. And still works and farms up in Decorah. We visited this place in a terrible high school flashback for me. We stopped along Milwaukee Avenue in the suburbs of Chicago, where I used to hang out as a high school kid, and stopped by this little isolated, poor prairie remnant, right? That remnant of prairie is embedded within this vast suburban landscape. But there it is, still there, still one of the richest prairies in all of northern Illinois. It's hardly wilderness. And we met up with a number of good friends working all throughout the Chicago area on prairie and savanna restoration. Dedicated volunteers out every weekend, pretty much. Hundreds of them, almost every weekend, are out somewhere in the greater Chicago area. So we're no longer even in the suburbs and small towns and rural areas. We're in suburbs now, right? We went to small towns. This is Burlington, Iowa. If you've been there, you recognize it, and the big river in the background. Aldo Leopold's hometown, just downstream from here. We visited other cities. Santa Fe, New Mexico, where Aldo Leopold was married in that church to his wife, Estella, who grew up there. Just off the, if you've been to Santa Fe, this is just off the plaza. Just a block or two. Beautiful little city, right? Santa Fe. We, of course, had to film in Madison. Madison, Wisconsin, always ranking among the best cities to live in because of its beautiful location and its interesting progressive ways. With its grand farmers market every weekend, 20,000 people. 20,000 people, the largest farmers market in the country. It has been a major force in the food movement all throughout the upper Midwest coming out of this experience. That was our mayor. We interviewed our former mayor, who on camera said, if I had not read Aldo Leopold as a teenager, I would not be mayor. So cities, we're in the cities. And the big city that I'm most familiar with, Chicago, since I did some growing up in the Chicago area. Again, Chicago. It's not something, if you're a conservationist, you think, wow, I want to study natural resources and then go to work in Chicago. But by golly, it's the most exciting big city in the world, I think, for conservation work. It includes people working in all communities across the city, including this one, Fuller Park, which is the poorest of the neighborhoods of Chicago. And it's in Fuller Park where this little place called Eden Place Nature Center lives under the railroad tracks coming out of downtown Chicago, overseen by this wonderful guy, Michael Howard, who's just a gem of a human being, who has devoted himself to giving kids in his neighborhood access to open space and to some educational experiences on this little couple-acre plot of land. Now, just to complete our little tour, we interviewed a few other folks, worked with them. By the way, these folks you keep seeing in all these, I'm taking the pictures, right? I'm supposed to be on camera, but while they're all getting their equipment set up, I'm documenting them, and that's what I was doing. So these are two filmmakers, the director and editor of the film, who live in California, so we were on the road a lot. We went to interview this fellow, Carl Safina. Another leading voice in conservation. His area is marine ocean conservation. Wonderful writer, too, by the way. If you haven't read any of his books, he's one of the best we have going. Song of the Blue Ocean, Voyage of the Turtle. Just these beautiful books about marine systems and organisms. And I highly recommend them. And Carl, you'll see him in the news now and then. Anytime there's an issue with the oceans, he shows up. Very articulate guy. Oh, I used that last photo, by the way, to talk about oceans. That's why I included that, oceans. But this one I used for skies. The big sky country down, this is way down on the borderlands. Literally, if you're standing where this photo's taken, 100 yards behind you is the border, the fence that we all hear so much about. It's not scary, guys. trust me on this. I should have the other photo where I show you the actual fence. I've worked in this area for 15 years now, and these ranchers are very dedicated conservationists down in this area called the Malpai Borderlands. Incredibly rich biological landscape, one of the most diverse landscapes in all of North America for various reasons that I won't go into right now. But it's that openness of the sky that I wanted to emphasize. So in the last 5 minutes, what have we done? We've gone from wilderness areas to agricultural landscapes, to suburban landscapes, to urban landscapes, to oceans, to the atmosphere. So keep that in mind as we go forward. So here's some of those characters. I didn't get into them all. There's even more. There's Will Allen. Some of you know Will maybe for his transformative work on urban agriculture in Milwaukee. It's now a movement. 15 years, 20 years ago when he started this, it was not a movement. It was one guy on the north side of Milwaukee saying, I want to grow food for the neighborhood here. And most people didn't know what to make of him. But he too is now a MacArthur genius and going all around the world talking about his transformative vision for helping urban people reconnect to their food systems and doing all sorts of great work in the process. So, think of all those characters and stories and places. The question is, what connects them all? What connects all these different people who claimed Aldo Leopold as an influence? And all these diverse ways and places in which his idea of a land ethic continues to grow and evolve in all these new ways. So that question has long been on my mind. Long before this project of making this film happened, I kept coming back, though, to one fact. Aldo Leopold is the only figure in all of our history in conservation and environmental thought who has a Center for Sustainable Agriculture here in Iowa named after him. You know, most people are now familiar with this. If you pay attention to food, you now know about the idea of food miles, right? How far your food travels to get. This is the Leopold Center in Ames that first did the study on that to quantify it. Leopold also has a wilderness area and a wilderness institute named after him. So what do we make of those seemingly random facts? Leopold is the only one who seems to have his name attached to all parts of this spectrum, from wildness to agriculture, and now even urban areas. So just to talk about that a little bit, here's the Gila Wilderness out in southwest New Mexico. Spectacular landscape that Leopold again worked in the 1920s to designate. So it's appropriate that his name is attached to wilderness, these areas and these institutions. He had a lifelong interest and passion for protecting wild places in our landscape, especially as the automobile became a dominant factor in the American landscape in the 1920s. He wrote voluminously, essay after essay, year after year, decade after decade, advocating that we should be protecting the last of our wild places. His argument changed over the years. It's fascinating to study this and see how his voice and his arguments change. But he never gave it up. To the dying day, he was passionate in his desire to protect wilderness. And put it into action too politically, helping to create the Wilderness Society. Still exists, still doing its work in national policies on this. But Leopold was also vitally interested and concerned with agriculture. Here's an Iowa shot. I was talking about this one a little earlier over dinner. This is not far from here, actually. I was driving down toward Burlington one night as the full moon was rising up over that horizon. I did not Photoshop this. It's actually the way it rose that day. So, Leopold was also devoted to agriculture, and his namesake now center over in Ames has been doing all this work, not just in Iowa, although that is its main focus. And again, it's entirely appropriate. He had a lifelong interest in advocacy for wiser ways of taking care of farmland, of all private lands, of these so-called working landscapes, farms, forests, ranches. And now with the food revolution that is unfolding, we can see it growing and expanding, gathering momentum. This aspect of Leopold's legacy, which was long forgotten, is now being recovered, reclaimed. Leopold's passion for helping us understand how to sustain ourselves on the landscapes we work and live in. It's not just the wilderness. And in his own work and life, he was extremely effective at doing this. This is one of my favorite photos of Aldo Leopold. 1936, give or take a year maybe. That's him there with his hat on and his sleeves rolled up. It's a very hot day in the middle of the 1930s, out on a farm southwest of Madison, where he had been working with that group of farmers to help improve wildlife habitat, basically, with his students, one of his grad students here. But here's where he lived. He lived in Madison. He lived in the city. So he's often associated with rural landscapes and wild places, but he lived in town. This is, for those of you who know Madison, this is 2 blocks west of Camp Randall Stadium. So he lived in town. That was Madison in the 1930s. That's his neighborhood. That's University Avenue, looking up toward the Capitol in Madison. Not far away was the University Arboretum, established in 1934, where Leopold was research director for the Arboretum, whose mission from the beginning was not to just put up trees with little tags on them to learn what the trees are, but to do something utterly radical, and that was to restore native ecosystems. Prairies, savannas, wetlands, forests, and to use it as a teaching and demonstration site. This photo is actually from the Curtis Prairie, the oldest restored prairie anywhere. So it's in the city. It's embedded within the city. So what do we make of this? How do we make sense of this central fact of Leopold's legacy, that it could be said to extend across this landscape, from wild places to working landscapes of farms, ranches, to suburban and urban settings? How do we make sense of the continuity across the landscape? Well, that's a question that others have begun to take on. So a couple slides here to illustrate this. These are just the next 3 slides are a series of books from the last 15, 20 years or so to illustrate how conservation has changed. It's no longer just about protecting wild places. It's about a lot of stuff. And this is in keeping with Leopold, who, as I sometimes say, didn't do triage with land. He didn't say, this is land we should care about. This is land we can ignore or sacrifice. This man was in love with land, and most of us who are conservationists are in love with land, no matter where it occurs. So we have begun to catch up with him in a sense. So I'm going to put my conservation biology hat on for a few minutes here again as I go through these next 3 slides. One trend of the last 15, 20 years is we've been rethinking sort of the spatial dimension of conservation. It isn't just putting a line around a place and saying it's now a protected place, we're done. It's about making connections across landscapes. It's about doing land stewardship across boundary lines. Because guess what? We've learned that just by setting aside an area and calling it a protected area, that doesn't protect it from anything. In fact, can work at counter purposes under the wrong circumstances. So spatially, we think about landscapes in a different way than we did when I was a student studying conservation biology. Yep. We also think about it differently in the time dimension. In the last 20 years, we've rethought our place in time, if you will. We understand that there's a lot of different ways of thinking about time and our place within it, whether it's these sweeping studies by Jared Diamond, for example, in Guns, Germs, and Steel, Bill Cronin, a colleague in Madison, arguing for rethinking the very concept of wilderness, in fact. So a lot of this goes on. Then there's another dimension that I'm going to mention. I just put this slide together last night. Time dimension, space dimension, but there's also this cultural dimension that is really arising even as we sit here. These 3 books are all published within the last 2 years. Some of them you recognize, obviously. The Pope he's done something. If you have not read in careful detail Laudato Si, I highly recommend it. Just fascinating to see how that institution is handling some of these changes. But it goes along in my mind anyway, with other expressions. And I'm just going to briefly mention these. Highly recommended if you want to take notes and read some great books. Laurette Savoy, this book just came out, and it's really her contemplation on African Americans and their relationship to land. The troubled relationship of black folks to the landscape. Highly insightful, and I hope you can get Laurette to come out here and talk to you sometime. She's a very good friend, and we've had long conversations about the African American experience and how that has been affected by and affected that cultural experience of connection to land and landscapes. Or another example, Robin Kimmerer, a botanist who writes and speaks from a Native American perspective. This is a powerful book. These are all powerful books, but Robin's, I just saw her last week. It'll knock your socks off, because it's really all about relationships. It's about exploring relationships between people, you and I, but it's also about relationships between you and I and the land, the landscapes we live on and depend on. And these can be very difficult conversations to have. We all know that. But we also, I think, know, all of us at some level, they're utterly necessary conversations to have. And it's not going to be coming from on high. It's going to be coming from people who care and take the time to speak and listen. And all three of these books, in my mind, are in the tradition of Aldo Leopold, sometimes quite explicitly. Laurette has a whole book, a whole chapter in her book, which is sort of a running conversation with Aldo Leopold. How is it that she, a 14-year-old girl growing up in an African-American family in Los Angeles, found resonance with this Midwestern wildlife biologist when she read his book, you know? So I really encourage, if you're interested in the cultural dimensions of all this, to explore some of these amazing voices. So I'm going to transition here a little bit to the next little phase of this talk, which goes back now, a story that begins 10 years ago now, and begins with trying to figure out how do we get to the next level on this. How do we understand our lives within whole landscapes? And we talked about this already, this connection between urban and rural places, or the disconnect, really. So this goes back to a conference out in New Mexico 10 years ago, and this conversation started for me at a whole new level about understanding the divisions in our culture between urban and rural people and urban and rural communities, and what that has meant for our landscape, for our human communities, for our political culture. And we can talk about this later on, maybe in Q&A, but this is what's playing out now in the national level every day, and will be for the next 9 months. In some degree, sense, it is a reflection of, in my view, this divide that has been allowed to grow between urban and rural constituencies. So let's give you a little context on this. We are now an urban society. Going back now more than 100 years, the rural population has been relatively steady, but the urban population has grown and grown and grown. This means a lot for conservation and environmental thinking. So the type of landscape that Leopold and his generation knew 100 years ago is very different, obviously, from the type of landscape you and I now live in. This is from a study done by the Wildlife Conservation Society. This goes back a ways now, 8 or 9 years, but still quite relevant and current. Here's the key thing to look at, is this scale. Landscapes with the least human influence, landscapes with the most human influence, i.e. wilderness on one end, cities on the other. The urban-rural divide, right? It's another map you can stare at a long time, isn't it? It's like, oh gosh, look where we are. There's no wildness here. Well, keep that in mind. And meanwhile, think out here. You know, we think of the West as wide open, but most people live in cities in the West. But the key point, again, it's not an urban-rural divide. It's a matter of degrees, right? No place is utterly wild, especially with climate change, changing everything. We all live under an atmosphere that has 400 plus parts per million of CO2 now. It's a humanized world. On the other hand, even the most urbanized place has wildness in it. There's a friend of mine whose sister, living in Chicago, ended up with a mountain lion in her stairwell. You remember that story? Remember that mountain lion that made it from the Black Hills across the Midwest, downtown Chicago? They had to shoot and kill that animal. It was in the north side of Chicago. There are coyotes living in downtown Chicago in the Loop. A colleague of ours studies them. There's wildness everywhere. And it changes. It's not static. Yep. Here's a more recent study that gets at the same concept, basically, of asking now over time how we've gone from a more wild planet, if you will, to one that's some degree more humanized, more affected by our actions on the landscape. There's a lot of back and forth on these kind of studies now as different researchers try to quantify this, but you get the point. Landscapes contain lots of human impact, and also they still contain lots of wildness. And some of you may be familiar with this term, a new term of the last decade, the Anthropocene, being proposed that we live in a new geologic era. And this term has now come into common use in academic circles, describing, as some say, the new recent age of man. And the guy who coined this term was using it, as it says here, as a way of describing radical change in nature, saying that our influence on the environment was so overwhelming that a new epoch, a new geologic epoch, the Anthropocene, has begun. And this made a big splash. It's not news to any of those who know their history, but for the general public, it was sort of a wake-up call, right? It means more than rewriting textbooks. It means thinking afresh about the relationship between people and their world and acting accordingly. And indeed it has. There's been raging debates about some fundamental questions about our relationship to landscapes. So, here's where we are. You and I can put ourselves maybe along a line between, on one side or the other, of urban and rural. But, in fact, we all live somewhere along a continuum, a gradient. Somewhere along that line, from urban to wild, is where you and I exist. And we move about. And there's different gradations, right? Smaller cities, smaller towns, there's different kinds of suburbs, right? There's working lands and ranches, protected areas, natural areas. So, how then are we to make sense of where we should be within that landscape? And how do we think about how all this has changed? And I've had to change this. I haven't quite updated it. I need to, but think back 2 generations. Think back to Leopold's last years, 1948. He died in 1948. He lived in a world that didn't know suburbs. Suburbs are post-World War II phenomenon, more or less. Not completely. But that's what began, this process of moving out of the cities into the suburbs. This is what I call the Mick Jagger School of Geography, because you can't get no satisfaction where you are. So you keep moving out, right? You're not satisfied in your suburb, you move out. Move to the next suburb, out further. You don't like that? Move out to the borders of the wild places. Fragment those. Isolate those. Can't get no satisfaction in your place. So you keep moving. And this has been was the pattern, I should say, for about 50 years. And then 2008 came along, the housing crisis. You were kids, most of you in this room. Upsets all of this. All of a sudden, people stopped moving the way they had been for 2 generations. But now, here's the challenge of sustainability. Those are all negative feedback loops. Why? Because every time you move out, you're creating more sprawl, more unsustainable activity. You're losing agricultural lands, you're losing wilderness, your cities are degrading. Our job is somehow to be able to rejigger all those loops, to transform them, as I say here, to build land health, resilience, and sustainability into the entire landscape. Instead of having bad feedback loops, having positive ones. Why is that important? Come back to that in a minute. But this is where I left that kind of sequence. I was trying to work this out in my own head. This is just kind of a fun way for me to do that. And that's where I left it. And then I said, oh, I forgot a few things. I forgot, darn it, I forgot the atmosphere. Got to have an atmosphere. Global climate change. Oh, I forgot the oceans. Yeah, darn oceans. I forgot all about them. So got to have oceans. And these are connected, obviously, we know this. Climate change isn't just the climate, it's the acidifying of the oceans connected to it. So again, how do we create healthier relationships, social relationships and environmental relationships? Because why? Because we can't sustain anything if the whole thing isn't sustainable. Your neighborhood, your city, your town, your farm, your natural area, your wild wilderness place, none of it is sustainable if the whole thing isn't sustainable. It's not rocket science. It's just a fact. If the world as a whole continues on its way, none of this is going to be sustainable within it. So the trick then again is, how do we think ourselves in this landscape? I'm going to quickly run through different portions of this landscape and see where we are. Traditionally, we focused on this part a lot, right? Obviously, protecting wild places. We protected Yellowstone. This is from Yellowstone. I took this photo in 1989, the spring after the great fires that consumed Yellowstone. Because we learned something, right? What did we learn? Wild places are not static. No place is static. They all have processes going on within them. Fire is a natural process. But is it acting normally? Is it acting the way it did historically? I'll show you a few other examples of this. Those of you who've studied this will be familiar to you. So the boundary waters up in northern Minnesota, where some of these studies were done, the most important studies on fire and fire history, helping us understand how fire works in the landscape. So you see all the different areas where intensive studies have shown how fire worked over many years. And you see these patterns emerge in the landscape. We begin to understand that fire isn't destructive. In fact, it's necessary. But it can get out of whack, right? We know that fire was used historically by native peoples. About this time in there, here's the Hayden Prairie. I was talking about this earlier. Lovely photo of the Hayden Prairie, the largest remaining prairie remnant in all of Iowa, just outside of Decorah. Some of you have been there, I'm sure. So those are the wild places. They change. They're at all scales, from big things like the boundary waters down to little prairies left in corners of Iowa. On our rural landscapes, this is that same area down on the Borderlands. Conservationists have gone to work there, working with ranchers, so that we get things like this. A friend of mine wrote this book, Working Wilderness. Maybe that's a contradiction in terms. If it's working, how can it be a wilderness? If it's a place that people use, how can it be wild? Well, it's not that simple. We're in that middle landscape again. This was just last week up in La Crosse. Who was up at Moses? Anyone? Oh. 3,000 people came to La Crosse from all over the country. The largest gathering of organic growers in the country. This is the map of certified organic farms. So here we are. We're in the thick of it. We're in the epicenter. It's happening. Sometimes this map doesn't have a label. Sometimes I like to just put up, say, guess what this map is? It takes a while for people to figure out what we have in common with California and New England. So we're in the middle landscape now of working landscapes. Here in Iowa, They're seed savers. We were talking about seed savers outside Decorah. Here's a new group. This is a group that started up just 2 years ago. Sustainable Iowa Land Trust, trying to get farmlands into protection and work with the landowners to do more sustainable practices. Or you can, any day, this was just last week too, you can go out and learn about creative things going on right here in your own backyard. How about the suburbs? Geez, what are we going to do with the suburbs? We've never had a sustainable suburb. We don't even know what that means. They've only been around for 2 generations in the way they exist now. And we're used to this pattern, right? You don't like the city. You want to move away from the city. You go out to a place like this. You chew up farmland. That's just a given. That's God's way God directed, right? We've been doing it for so long. No, we've been doing it for about 50 years. And so there's been a revolution in ways of thinking about planning communities, integrating different values. This is a community on the north suburbs of Chicago, Prairie Crossing. Famous because they decided not to develop the whole thing. They decided to build in an organic farm and to build in prairie restoration and to concentrate the houses so they're more walkable. A radical rethinking of how to do a suburban development. It's so radical that it becomes, oh my gosh, developing a suburb with principles. In the New York Times headline, wow, what a radical idea. Experiment on the prairie. And in the cities, let's go to the cities for a minute. Same area, I actually took this photo in that same area. Chicago wilderness, there's a term for you. If you don't know it, seems like a contradiction, but it's a movement in Chicago. I won't give you the whole story here, but in the last 20 years, Chicago Wilderness has emerged as an umbrella organization that includes more than 350 organizations, all working together, all across Chicago, from north side to south side, out beyond the urban area itself, out into the surrounding counties, to try to bring conservation thinking and planning and work to the Chicago area. This is, of course, overlooking Millennium Park in Chicago, but this is sort of the revisioning of a city. Rethinking what an urban environment can offer if you bring a conservation mindset to it. The green infrastructure of Chicago and other cities have undertaken exercises like this. And of course, a big part of this for all of us is getting kids involved. I'm sure you've heard many talks and read things about the disconnect between young kids, especially with the social media at our control now, and losing touch. You know, the last child in the woods kind of thing. This happens to be Albuquerque, a day of restoration work on the Rio Grande. Detroit, abandoned. A city troubled for generations now. Or choose Flint, Michigan. Maybe I should choose Flint next time. Well, Detroit's become an experimental area for people trying to revive their neighborhoods, particularly through this exercise of urban gardening and farming. It's become an experimental zone for that sort of thing, and not because someone on high is directing people to do it. It's because people need to do it. Detroit. Or Dubuque. Dubuque. Who is involved with Sustainable Dubuque here? All right. I cannot tell you more about this. I just took this off the internet last night, but you can perhaps tell us more about what's going on here. And I did, however, notice that this conference is coming to Dubuque later in the year. You're going to have people from all over the country coming here to talk about sustainable communities. So, here we are again. And this is really what all this is building to, is this slide. Think across that landscape, across the landscape from urban to wild. There's stuff going on everywhere. There's movements for sustainable cities, for green building, for urban agriculture, green jobs, green design. In the suburbs, new ways of thinking about planning and design, permaculture, and bringing agriculture to these different landscapes. In that working landscape of farms and ranches, we have the local movement, the organic movement, sustainable agriculture and ranching, land trusts, all sorts of other things. And in our efforts to protect our wildest places, we're doing new things. We're thinking about whole ecosystems, not just the postage stamp Hayden Prairie. not just the wilderness, but its context. How to connect things, how to connect people across the landscape, through all these different things, through doing restoration of prairies, savannas, wetlands, forests, by putting a value on these things so that we can begin to make our economic system work for healthy landscapes and communities, for community-based approaches, watershed approaches, renewable energy systems, on and on and on. And the point of this slide is to say your passion may be here, your passion may be here, your passion may be in the cities. But wherever you are, there's a place for you to plug in. There is a place, and you don't have to be a professional conservation person. You may be, but you may be, as some of you here, nurses or aviation. I know that that is a thing too. You may be a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant. You may be whatever you are, but there is a place for you not only to plug in, it's utterly necessary for us all to plug in wherever we are in that landscape because it's all connected. So that has led me, in fact, to rethink my own definition of sustainability. For me, now something is sustainable when it contributes to healthier and more resilient connections across the landscape. And if it undermines our connections and relationships, it's not sustainable. It's as much a social definition as it is an ecological one. So that brings us back to this big picture. And to bring it back home a little bit to your local landscape here on the upper Mississippi River. It's a little bit upstream. So I'll take the last few minutes to talk about the things that connect us. Water connects us. Watersheds connect us. We're all connected, all of us in this room, by water, which I'm going to connect to right now. Watersheds connect us. There's where we are. That's where we live. The Mississippi River watershed. I was down here a couple years ago. I crossed over a road right here. It said, "Welcome to the Mississippi River watershed." I said, whoa. And we can't solve the problems in New Orleans or the Gulf of Mexico if we do not solve the problem of the whole watershed, which means a vast transformation of agriculture. It means connecting people new and different. These are my heroes. These are the Ojibwe water walkers. These are the women whose job in Ojibwe culture is to care for the water. They are the water keepers. Just a couple years ago, they were walking from Lake Itasca to New Orleans. They do this, you'll see, they carry a copper kettle of water from the headwaters. The men walk along carrying staffs. That's their job. The women are the water keepers. They have now done this. They walked around the Great Lakes. They walked up and down the Mississippi River. They walked up the St. Lawrence Seaway across the Great Lakes to Duluth, Minnesota last year. These are not young women, by the way. The founder of this movement is now about 70 years old, and she stands about like this. They are carrying the water, both physically and spiritually. Water connects us. Food connects us. This is why the food movement is so powerful. It connects us from the urban to the rural. It rebuilds those connections into our landscape and into our lives. These are all mostly from Dubuque, yes. Wildlife connects us. Species connect us. Sandhill cranes. Saw my first one of the year last week. Just got back to the upper Midwest. So we're connected by the living things that share our landscapes. Cranes are easy ones. We see and hear them. But it's other things we don't ever think about. Things like the paddlefish, right? Coming up the Mississippi River, for example. We're connected by these are their landscapes too, right? They live among us. They are our neighbors. Or my favorite, the bur oak. The species range of the bur oak that we sit in the middle of. They connect us. Our economies connect us. So here we are, Iowa Valley Food Co-op. This is also from Iowa. It's kind of the two ends of the spectrum. Healthy economies, supporting local people and communities. Rural decline and depression. It's part of the same reality we have to deal with. So those are the things that connect us from urban and to wild, right? Food, biodiversity, energy, history, our stories, all of these things connect us. And here's kind of the take-home final great little quote I came up with to say what I really want to say, and I should have just cut to this from the beginning. We can dwell on all these things that divide us, and there are lots of people doing that every day. There's a lot of money to be made in dividing us, but we all live within landscapes that connect us. And so when Aldo Leopold, at the end of his essay, The Land Ethic, made this point, that it's up to you and I to continue this work, he framed this idea of us being connected in relationship in our landscapes, saying, you know, I presented this land ethic, this idea of our being in a community with the land, saying it's a product of social evolution, because nothing so important as an ethic is ever written. It evolves in the minds of a thinking community, and you and I are that thinking community. We are the ones charged now with making these connections. And this is the last slide. I'm so glad that the class I was in today is using this book, A Moral Ground. It's a stunning collection that I was privileged actually to contribute a little bit to, but a statement that I'll close with here that comes from the end of the introduction in that book. We must develop the moral imagination that will allow us to see ourselves in the places of our progeny, to see the world through their large eyes, to imagine their sorrows and their hopes, not so different from our own. We must learn to listen to the earth, which resounds with the wisdom we can hear if we try, no matter where you are, I would add. This thriving future will require the greatest exercise of moral imagination the world has ever seen. No small statement. And that's our charge, right? So I've gone on way much longer than I expected. I haven't done this talk in a while. But I did want to include some of these more local connections to Iowa and what's going on right here, because you're in a good spot. You're in a great spot in this community and in this larger driftless area landscape along the upper Mississippi, the great artery of the continent, to really do things locally that will be contributing to that realization of a new moral imagination. So that's a big picture. I know it's kind of a sweeping view of all this, and I'm very eager to get back to kind of details and pragmatic ideas about how we move forward on all this, but thank you for your attention in sitting through this presentation. What do you think?
Sure.
I'll be the moderator for the questions.
Anyone have any questions?
Great idea, thank you.
Yes.
What did Mr. Leopold, do you have any ideas on population, you know, talking about urbanization, what population, so food production?
Question was whether Leopold had anything to say or offer on the theme of human population and population growth. He did. Not a lot, because the awareness of human population as a factor, it was there, but it was not as urgent as it would become in later decades. But Leopold was fundamentally, in his own professional work, a population ecologist. He understood populations. He became increasingly concerned with World War II, because he thought of war in a very different way than you and I do. He thought of war as almost an ecological phenomenon, right? An expression of a human population out of control and out of whack. And he wrote about that. He was also in touch with some of the leading thinkers anywhere at that time who were beginning to wrestle with these questions. And he wrote a lot about the connections between our consumption and population. And it is always just, it's not just population alone, it's not just our numbers, but the way those numbers operate in the world. So he expressed his concerns and died in 1948, just as the population issue was beginning to be raised globally. I showed the Pope's statement. I just happened over the last few days to reread parts of it that had to do with population. You know, Catholic Church isn't going to go there very far and fast. But there's a chance to have a conversation now that didn't exist before. And it's going to be very interesting to watch in the years ahead whether there is more opportunity at least to have some conversations across what is probably the touchiest, most difficult conversation in all of this. And we'll see. We'll see if it opens up some new opportunities for that. Yeah.
What are some effective approaches that you have used to in giving speeches and talks to different crowds to a more like a crowd that would be more on the opposition side, or the ones who don't, you know what I mean, like ones who don't believe in, don't want to accept climate change and things. So what are some different strategies or ways you've done presented things that might be effective, I guess?
Yeah. Well, as has been said, you start with people where they are. And so, first of all, it's trying to figure out where people are. So I tend personally to go into silent mode a lot and try to hear where if you're in a difficult conversation, to hear where this person's coming from. Because you can't make progress if you're not knowing what they're thinking. So I will often just sit and listen and ask questions and try to find the point of common ground. And who knows what that'll be. Could be they love birds. Could be their grandfather was a gardener. It could, who knows. But looking for the piece of common ground and beginning to understand their story. Because I do believe that they don't want to engage in that conversation just for the fun of it. They don't like arguing if you want to argue. They're curious. They want to know. They're testing you. So I understand that. So sometimes I'll just listen. Depends on the setting, depends on the audience. But I don't know a human being. I've never met a human being who does not have some connection to land or nature or family or whatever that doesn't allow you to have an opening. You find out where it is and you just try to stay focused on that. I could give lots of examples like this. It happens all the time. I'll give you one. My brother. My brother's an engineer. He's my oldest brother, so he was mean and beat up on me and did all that stuff. But we get along fine. He's a good guy. But he was an engineer, and we didn't talk about any of this stuff for years. Because I was I call him the green sheep of the family. I was the green guy. And he was the engineer. He worked for a paper company. Well, his business began to change. About the mid-'80s, he began to get all these contracts to build recycling mills. And all of a sudden, he's making all this money building recycling mills. Suddenly, we were friends. He began to understand that just because I have a different view of the world doesn't mean they're incompatible and doesn't mean you can't enjoy happy, friendly relations. Not that we were ever in bad relations. It's just, there's a point where it had to change a little bit. And I had to learn. I had to learn his world a little bit more than I had. And he's done some stunning things as an engineer in designing new systems that are incredibly efficient. And so we begin to have an evolving relationship around that. And I could go on and on about this, but that's one example. And so trying to find where that point of common ground is at least where I tend to start.
Any more questions? Let's give them a round of applause.
I'm happy to hang around if you're too shy to ask in public.